Anime and manga with the message that violence is bad aren't exactly rare or unique. The theme of basically every single Mobile Suit Gundam installment has been war is bad since the series started in 1979, but Vinland Saga is perhaps one of the best executions of this theme that I've seen not just in anime and manga, but in media writ large. Whereas many shows use violence as spectacle to entertain the viewer, Vinland Saga Season 2 is extremely discerning in its use of violence. When there is action, the show pulls no punches. Rather than being there to titillate the viewers, what violence that is portrayed is shown in its grotesque, horrific entirety. Like many people, I came into the second season of Vinland Saga remembering not much besides the broad strokes of the first season. I watched the entirety of the first season over a course of a couple days in the beginning of 2020. I remember generally liking the show a lot. The brutal Viking fights were highly entertaining. I remember Askeladd being an absolute gigachad at the conclusion of the show, but I forgot most of the finer details from that first season. So when I started watching the second season, I expected more or less the same from what we got in the first season. Specifically, more high-octane Viking battles. But what I got was far from what I was initially expecting. Rather than reintroduce us to any of the characters we got to know in the first season, the first episode of the second season focuses on a totally new character, Einar, who is sold into slavery after Vikings raid his home, killing his mother and sister in the process. It's only towards the conclusion of that episode that we finally see Thorfinn again, albeit he's almost completely unrecognizable from how we left him at the end of the first season. Compared to the once sprightly ball of rage training ceaselessly in combat to avenge the death of his father, the Thorfinn we see in the start of Season 2 is but a husk of his former self. His hair is a disheveled mess, and the hollowness of his eyes clearly illuminate that he's basically given up the will to live. He more or less walks through life like a zombie. This is in stark contrast to Einar, who is full of spirit and motivation to earn his freedom back. To be honest, after watching the first 2 episodes, I stopped watching new episodes. I thought I was going to get to see more Viking battles, not Harvest Moon. Based on what I've seen online, I was hardly alone in that assessment. But that's where it sat for the better part of 2 months, until I decided to download all of the episodes I missed to watch while I was on a plane. Unlike Season 1, which focuses on Thorfinn's unceasing quest for revenge and Askeladd's scheming, the second season focuses on Thorfinn's search for meaning. For the entirety of Season 1, Thorfinn dedicates himself to growing as a fighter in order to one day get revenge for the death of his father by killing Askeladd. It doesn't matter how many people he kills, as long as one day it enables him to enact his revenge. The juxtaposition between Season 1 Thorfinn and Season 2 Thorfinn, perhaps one of the biggest changes I've seen in any character in any anime or manga series. The once vibrant Thorfinn who would jump at the slightest provocation is reduced to a listless husk that passively accepts whatever happens around him. When the farmhands steal their lunch, rather than protest and escalate the situation as Einar does, Thorfinn bows his head and ingratiates himself to people who clearly disdain him for being a slave, despite the fact that they're barely any higher on the totem pole as tenement farmers. Thorfinn's change of demeanor is more understandable in the context of how we leave him at the end of Season 1. At the end of Season 1, we see Thorfinn's entire purpose for being snatched away in front of his eyes. Rather than finally realizing his goal of killing Askeladd in a duel, Askeladd is unceremoniously stabbed to death by Canute, the timid pretty boy Thorfinn spent half of the season following around. Is it any wonder then why Thorfinn looks like the life has been completely sucked out of him? He has no reason to live, no home to go back to, and no family or comrades left. This is fundamentally the question that drives the second season of Vinland Saga. Rather than being focused on his quest for revenge, the season focuses heavily on Thorfinn's new internal struggle for meaning, now that the cause that once animated his life has been snuffed out. Episode 3 is when this internal conflict is made explicit, and also when I was finally sold on this new season. In the previous episode, we're introduced to Olmar, the master's feckless son who yearns to one day become a real man by fighting, rather than managing the farm like his father does. We later learn that this disposition is no doubt informed by his older brother, Thorgil, a veritable machine of killing and bloodshed. The premise of episode 3 is that Olmar, despondent that no one respects him as a warrior, is convinced by the guests basically mercenaries hired for the defense of the farm to prove his manhood by killing someone. And wouldn't you know it, it's Einar and Thorfinn who get singled out for this idiotic endeavor. As expected, Olmar is ultimately unable to go through with arbitrarily killing Thorfinn, passing that honor onto Fox, who is ostensibly one of the leaders among the guests. Fox attempts to goad and mock Thorfinn, asking him if he's afraid of his impending death. Thorfinn, as expected, doesn't really react, and goes on to proclaim that nothing good has ever come of him being alive. Fox, clearly dissatisfied with the reaction he's getting, begins to slash at Thorfinn, cutting him all over his skin. But still, Thorfinn remains stoic and unaffected, clearly beginning to rattle Fox. Of course, we as the viewer know the complete ridiculousness of the situation. Compared to Thorfinn, who has killed hundreds of men and has fought against some of the fiercest Viking warriors, the guests are basically a joke, having lived mostly peaceful lives on Kettle's idyllic farm. Even unarmed, Thorfinn could easily snuff out Fox and all of the other guests put together. The irony of the whole situation is that Thorfinn, the lowest status person, a slave, who is completely unarmed and not resisting at all, is clearly the one most in control during this situation. Throughout the whole scene, I found myself wondering, surely this is the part where we see the old Thorfinn. There's no way that he just stands there and lets himself get killed. But Thorfinn continues to remain placid, resulting in Fox eventually cutting off part of his ear. It's at this point that Snake steps in and disciplines them for attempting to kill their master's property. Bemused by Thorfinn's demeanor, Snake goes on to draw his sword. For the first time this season, we see a glimpse of the old Thorfinn, recognizing Snake as a legitimate warrior. Unlike the guests who are largely buffoons LARPing as warriors, Thorfinn's instincts from years of combat kick in. His body leaps into action, swiftly attempting to block Snake's swing. Despite his claims to the contrary, Thorfinn's body is clearly not prepared to die. It's this encounter that sets into motion Thorfinn's internal reckoning, as he attempts to come to terms with all of the people he's killed in service of his fruitless quest for revenge. Immediately following this episode, we're reintroduced to Canute, who has grown into a ruthlessly pragmatic leader of the Vikings. Not needlessly cruel like his father, but still more than willing to resort to underhanded tactics to achieve his goals. It's eventually revealed that Canute had his brother, with whom he shared a close and loving relationship, poisoned to death in order to secure his rule over all of the Viking territories. The juxtaposition between Thorfinn and Canute's characters is one of the most interesting aspects of this season to me. While we see Thorfinn reject the cycle of violence and revenge that defined the majority of his life, Canute seemingly heads in the opposite direction. The young man who once abhorred weapons is now more than willing to poison his own brother just to secure his control and authority. He later goes on to manipulate Olmar in order to fabricate a casus belli to requisition Kettle's farm, despite Kettle's more than willingness to support and pay tribute to Canute. In episode 9, we see Thorfinn's internal conflict come to a head after he gets into a fight with a group of farmhands that sabotage the wheat he and Einar planted. While unconscious, Thorfinn dreams of himself falling into what is ostensibly Valhalla, but is more akin to a hell. A place where the Vikings go to engage in constant, fruitless fights with one another, a kind of logical endpoint for their society that venerates might and violence above all else. There he meets Askeladd, sitting atop a pillar, overlooking the carnage, who explains the situation. While there's no hope for himself or the other Vikings trapped in this cycle of violence, there's still hope for Thorfinn. He could choose to escape this wretched lifestyle. It's quite fitting that it's Askeladd's memory that spurs his change in Thorfinn. In the end, Thorfinn wound up knowing Askeladd for longer than his own father, even if he spent most of that time trying to kill him. Askeladd, as based as he might have been, and as much as he might not have liked the Vikings, was ultimately a man of violence through and through. Even he had some more noble intentions than the average Viking, Askeladd ultimately wound up being a more than willing participant in the violence and bloodshed of Norse society. Fittingly, Askeladd jumps into the pit of warriors in order to aid Thorfinn in pulling himself out to the surface, a reflection of Askeladd's dying wish for Thorfinn not to end up in the same place as him. While he might not have been able to change, Thorfinn still can. In the end, Askeladd's death ultimately does end up giving Thorfinn's life meaning. it gave him the impetus he needed to start anew and move past the rage, anger, and violence that defined so many years of his life. Thorfinn is finally able to internalize Askeladd's dying words. He's finally able to move forward. On the other hand, Canute's increasing embrace of ruthless, underhanded tactics is mediated through hallucinations he has of his father's severed head. While Thorfinn is able to move past violence and hatred, Canute becomes more and more like the father he abhorred. As Thorkill elegantly shouts to Canute after he pacifies England, there's no way for Canute to avoid violence and bloodshed. Rather than reject the violence endemic to Norse society, Canute fully embraces said violence, willing to make any sacrifice, break any promise, cross any line, as long as it furthers his goal of reshaping the Viking kingdoms. It's this unwavering commitment to ruthless pragmatism that sets in motion the final conflict of the season. Needing to raise new funds, Canute decides that he needs to requisition Kettle's farm. To do so, he invites Kettle and his sons, Olmar and Thorgil, to the capital. Olmar, still wishing to prove himself to be a true Norse warrior, petitions Canute to join the royal guard, like his older brother, Thorgil. Olmar, unsurprisingly, makes a complete fool of himself in front of the king. To escalate the situation, the king sends a group of men to deliver Olmar's, completely expected, rejection, and humiliate him in the process. Still unable to accept his own ineptitude, Olmar challenges one of the men to a duel, despite the fact that he would probably lose and that the king is forbidden dueling. Knowing that this was the likely outcome, Canute dispatches one of his retainers to rig the duel in Olmar's favor by flinging a coin into the other man's eye, throwing him off and allowing Olmar to land a killing blow to his neck. Outraged, the fallen man's comrades also come after Olmar, at which point Thorgil, a veritable machine of death, steps in and easily dispatches them. Despite the fact that they may have protected Olmar's honor, Olmar and Thorgil end up playing exactly into Canute's hand, giving him the rationale he needs to requisition Kettle's farm. Realizing what's happened, this course of events sends Kettle spiraling into a deep depression. On their voyage back to the farm, Kettle spends most of that time cooped up inside of a barrel. While he claims to be Iron Fist Kettle, a fearsome warrior, he in fact just co-opted that identity for convenience because they happen to share the same name. Kettle was initially introduced as being a reasonably nice and just man, unlike most of the other lunatics Thorfinn and Einar interact with. He generously provides them with the chance to earn back their freedom. After Pater provides evidence that the farmhand sabotaged the pair's wheat, he puts the whole issue to bed, despite the fact that the punishment for a slave raising a hand to a free man is usually death. But beneath this veneer of generosity is a deeply cowardly and despicable man, perhaps one of the most despicable characters in this show. Earlier in the season, a pair of children are caught stealing food from the farm. Stank argues, over Kettle's objections, that the children should be flogged to discourage thieves from stealing from them in the future. Kettle eventually acquiesces and sentences each child to be flogged 10 times. Presumably knowing that Thorgil's strength would basically kill the kids, Kettle intervenes and carries out the beating himself. The incident greatly distresses Kettle, despite the fact that as the master of the farm, he could have put his foot down and simply refused to have the children beaten. Eventually he decides that protecting his reputation and the farm is more important than, not beating the crap out of children. Later that night, Kettle, believing himself to be the victim here, rather than the kid he beat within an inch of his life, seeks comfort from Arneid, one of the slaves who has no choice but to stroke his ego, despite the fact that Arneid's eyes reveal her deep contempt for Kettle. The entire point of Kettle's character is an indictment of the institution of slavery. Even though he might treat his slaves marginally better than most, even promising them freedom, he's ultimately just a narcissist who strokes his own ego by not treating his slaves like complete subhumans. There's no such thing as ethical slavery. Any veneer of Kettle being a good person completely breaks down once he returns from the capital. After having to cope with the fact that the King of Denmark is going to send a force to steal his farm from him, Kettle returns to his farm to learn that Arneid, his property that he uses for emotional and physical support, tried to run off with her husband, another slave who had freed himself by killing his master. Seeing his life rapidly crumble around him, Kettle attempts to regain some semblance of control by beating one of the only people weaker than him, a pregnant woman. While Kettle was away, witnessing Olmar make a fool of himself and bringing ruin to his family, we're introduced to Gardar, Arnaid's husband who was enslaved on a farm nearby. Gardar, fed up with the abuse that he suffered, revolts and kills his masters. He then sets off to find Arnaid so that they can return to Sweden. Gardar's character serves as the first test of Thorfinn's commitment to non-violence, and yet another commentary on the futility of the cycle of violence. Gardar is justifiably outraged at the men who broke up his family, raided his village, and subjected him to torturous abuse. Understandably, he lashes out and responds with violence, killing several of the guests on Kettle's farm. But this proves to be not only a futile action, but a actively counterproductive one, as it winds up with both him and Arnaid dying. Gardar's resemblance to Einar is both plot relevant, but also symbolically important. Gardar is portrayed as borderline animalistic, with his disheveled hair, unkempt appearance, and eyes that become devoid of color when he becomes consumed with violence and hatred. A look that we see replicated with Einar when he becomes consumed with that same rage, after he discovers that Kettle beat his beloved Arnaid to death. After seeing an unconscious Kettle being carried by Snake, Einar becomes unable to contain his hatred for Kettle. His eyes glaze over much in the same way that Gardar's do. Thorfinn futilely attempts to speak to Einar to snap him out of it, knowing that nothing good will come of Einar killing Kettle as an act of revenge, no matter how much he might deserve it. In the end, Thorfinn is forced to punch Einar in the face to snap him out of it. No doubt a difficult choice considering Thorfinn's new commitment to non-violence. Finally, we have the climax of the first season, the Battle of Kettle's farm. Fed up with how the privileged and peaceful life he developed is deteriorating, Kettle conscripts all of his farmhands to fight, promising that he'll forgive their debts if they win. The farmers, none the wiser, gleefully trot into battle armed with literal pots and pans in some cases. Of course, Kettle has to know that this is a futile proposition. There's no way a group of untrained serfs have any chance of beating the elite Jomsvikings. But this remains even more evidence of Kettle's cowardness and narcissism. Rather than swallow his pride and surrender his farm, he decides he'd rather lead all of his workers to a certain death. To be quite honest, I would be lying if I said I wasn't looking forward to this episode. Since the proposition was introduced in episode 12, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe we'd get another one of those grand Viking battles from season 1. Maybe we'd finally see the return of season 1 Thorfinn as he rises to the defense of the farm. Of course, none of that ends up happening. The promised battle ends up being more like a one-sided slaughter, the logical and expected outcome. The battle itself gets surprisingly little screen time. What screen time is dedicated to the battle is mostly just clips of Kettle's men being dismembered and dying horrific deaths at the hands of the Jomsvikings. As someone with a soft spot for pre-modern war stories like Kingdom or Arslan Senki, I was initially rather disappointed with how the whole thing wrapped up. There was no grand battle, no heroic defense of the farm, just men dying ingloriously for a megalomaniac landlord. That feeling of disappointment was followed by a feeling of shame. The entire point of Vinland Saga is an indictment of violence, no matter how endemic it is around you or how easy it is to fall into. And yet, here I am, still wishing in the back of my mind for animated violence to entertain myself. No doubt, I myself am a part of the problem that Vinland Saga discusses. Funnily enough, in the end, Olmar gets a bit of a redemption arc. Having to choose between either surrender or fighting to the death, Olmar chooses to surrender. Despite the fierce objections of his mother, Olmar, a man who spends the entirety of the season being a feckless loser, ultimately finds his courage. Contrary to the norms of the times, courage is not about being willing to fight and die. Sometimes true courage and being a real warrior is about being able to reject violence, even when violence would be the easy way out. The second season of Vinland Saga is one of the most profound rejections of violence and armed conflict I've seen in any anime series. And this discussion oversimplifies and glosses over a lot of very important and well-executed plot points, like a more in-depth analysis of Gardar or Arnaid, or the eventual reuniting of Canute and Thorfinn. The characters, plot, and animation all work seamlessly together to reinforce the futility of violence. Characters like Gardar, Omar, or Canute are all portrayed as deeply flawed yet understandable characters who act out in the only way they know how, through violence. But the show doesn't portray violence and fighting as some epic, entertaining affair, as it so often is in anime. Rather, the violence that is shown in Vinland Saga is terrifying, horrific, and sometimes extremely difficult to watch. The fact that Vinland Saga is able to transition from a season that's all about Vikings duking it out to the death to creating a second season that's more compelling, despite the fact that it's ostensibly all about farming, is a testament to the strength of its execution. The idea that violence is bad is a truism, far from an original premise, but it's a premise that Vinland Saga Season 2 executes with remarkable precision and efficacy.